Welcome, everyone, to another installment of Coffee with Carl. Today, I have the pleasure of esteemed ESOP expert, Rick Jaye, here from Business Transition Advisors. Welcome, Rick.
Carl, thank you for the opportunity today.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. So today, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what ESOPs are, why you may consider them, how they work, what that path looks like, some of the different tax advantages are, and then ultimately why it may make sense for your business today. So with that, why don't we start off just talking a little bit about, what ESOPs are in general, Rick, and, why they have become a common exit and liquidity strategy, for some business owners in general.
Yeah, perfect. So in ESOP, as you referenced, is a type of exit planning strategy. So it does provide the liquidity transfer of having a business owner who's got all their sort of chips tied up in the value of the business. And it allows them to take those chips, some or all of the chips, off the table so they can get paid for what that value is. And the benefit of an ESOP when it comes to the process, since it's an internal sale, meaning that the employees are ultimately getting the benefit through an ESOP, which is a qualified retirement plan. And we'll talk a little bit about that, later, about how that works and the nature of it. But the benefit for the exit planning is that it's an option that an owner has, and where it really makes sense over when you think about either a management buyout or you think about a sale, hiring an investment banker and transitioning it to a private equity firm or a strategic buyer, a competitor in your market, or even outside of your market. Where the ESOP is really attractive is it gets into the philosophical approach. Owners that do an ESOP typically care as much about the business, the legacy, the community, their customers, and then most importantly, their employees, who they really look at as part of the family. That they want to do something for them that allows them to be rewarded for the hard work and effort they put into making the business and the family that owns the stock successful over time. And so that the byproduct is that, you get paid for the value as a selling shareholder, and you can still operate it, run it, stay on board, run the board of directors, stay on board as a CEO for as long as you choose, but you're really protecting the legacy of the business because nothing theoretically changes in the way the business operates moving forward post-transaction. So that's kind of where it separates itself from any other transaction, is that continuity of the business, the legacy, and it's just more like what I call a feel-good transaction. It's doing well for a business owner by doing good.
Why don't you walk us through what some characteristics of a business that may consider this type of plan?
That's a great question. So because of the nature of how an ESOP works, and we're going to really focus on what they call a leveraged ESOP, which is when there's cash or sort of dollars coming out of the value of the business to the selling shareholder, which is the most common approach. It's really, the term in the industry is called a leverage buyout. We're actually borrowing money. The company's going to borrow the money on the value of the business. That cash comes into the corporation, and the corporation is going to write the check to buy the stock from the selling shareholders, either partial sale or 100% sale. And so the key is, when you talk about a leverage buyout, cash flow is the most important. The saying is the three most important things in real estate are always location, location, location. The three most important things in an ESOP, since it's a leverage buyout, is cash flow, cash flow, cash flow. So what I mean by that is anybody that's going to consider doing an ESOP has to understand that they have to have relatively consistent cash flow on a year-by-year basis to be able to support the company's ability to be able to finance and pay off that debt that it's taking on to buy the company over time. So think about it from the opposite perspective. Companies that wouldn't really qualify or be good candidates for an ESOP, think about real estate developers. While they're building out their, one or two, let's say, apartment buildings, which take them 18 to 24 months to complete, they're going to the bank, they're usually leveraging the company up, they're borrowing money, they've got a small portion of equity that they put into buying the land, but it's a leverage transaction. They're paying interest on their note, or they're rolling the interest up until they get it built. So during that 2 to 3 year time frame until they get the get the apartment leased up, there's really no cash flow coming back to the developer. That would be a very poor transaction of an ESOP. But on the opposite side, think about the general contractor that actually is constructing it on behalf of the builder. That general contractor is constantly receiving cash flow from the developer for the build out of the property as they hit certain metrics. And that cash flow is usually pretty consistent. They usually go into a project, if they're a good general contractor, knowing how to manage the overhead of the project. They've got subs they can rely on. So they really know what their profit margins are going to be at the end of the road. And so contractors or any of the subcontractors, engineering firms, any firm that really has consistent cash flow from a financial perspective makes a good candidate. The other component to that is, again, getting back to the philosophy. It's getting back to an owner. Since the too big to fail of 2008 and the changes in the banking industry, banks are limited today under their FDIC guidelines of how much of a loan they can actually provide to a business today. And that usually is no more than 3 times what they call EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So if your business sells at, let's say, a 6 multiple, to make it simple, so you've got 5 million of EBITDA, you've got a 6 times 5 or a $30 million valuation. The most that a bank would ever lend on that type of transaction would be 3 times. So in that case, it would be 15 million of the $30 million sale. The second portion, if you're going to sell 100% of the company, would be taken back as a seller note. So the sellers would take back a note. There's some advantages of doing that, but the byproduct is they're only getting 15 million of cash up front. The rest is coming from cash flow over a period of time once the bank gets paid off, and then they get paid off principal and interest after that takes place. So for an owner that really wants to just walk away, take their cash, an ESOP shouldn't be considered because of that delayed sort of financial ramification. Whereas if you hire an investment banker and sell to a private equity firm or a strategic buyer, in those cases, you usually get 70 to 90% of the price of what you're selling it for in cash up front. You've got a small portion you may roll back in if it's a private equity deal, or you might have an earn out with a strategic buyer. But either way, you're getting the vast majority of your money up front. It allows you then to take your money, walk away from the business. And for owners that are really looking at that strategy, they're really not interested in sticking around. And it's not that they don't care about their management team and their employees. They just are more focused on what the financial ramifications are for them and their families. And that's fine. That's just not what an ESOP is.
Have you found the market to be, with interest rates, being a bit higher, and obviously you mentioned one key point, which, is from cash flow. How has the market really been affected recently? I mean, have you seen less deals just because of the difficulty in, financing, maybe some of the financing cost? And then I think you obviously, for folks listening, and I think Rick highlighted a really important point, just cash flow, because you're not going to be able to get, as he mentioned, anywhere from 70 to 90% upfront that you may be getting from an outright sale. So you have to be able to have that actual cash flow in the business. So maybe walk us through some of your experiences more recently, just in the more challenging interest rate environment, and how it's really affected deals, if at all.
Well, first of all, Carl, you don't need me on this call because you're so damn smart. You're the one that can answer all these questions because you sort of led right into it. I'm going to start at the end of the discussion or into the question and work backwards. As far as the sort of the number of transactions that are taking place, we've seen a dramatic reduction in M&A deals, meaning private equity and strategic acquisitions, starting to pick up a little bit more now. But for the last 2.5 to 3 years, that industry has really collapsed. Partly because if you think about it, most private equity firms are financing the acquisition, and as interest rates now are growing, and during the height of COVID, with both supply chain issues and employment issues with people coming, not working out of the offices, and companies being highly damaged in many industries from the downturn that did take place. There was a question of whether firms wanted to step up and take on that risk and do acquisitions. So there was a lot of reduction in that world. The opposite is in the ESOP world. Even though interest rates now, we've seen 625 basis point increases off the low, just over a 16-month period of time, which is unprecedented in the industry, in society from a financial perspective. Even though you would think that since this is a leveraged buyout, it would have a negative effect on being able to do ESOP transactions or some type of leveraged buyout, it's actually had the opposite effect. And I think it's because you get back to the fundamental premise and the philosophy behind why owners look at doing ESOPs over the other strategies. Again, most of the owners we work with, although they want to be treated fairly through the transaction, they're more focused on making sure the business is perpetuated, their employees are protected and rewarded, and the company has the capability of continuing to grow and survive and succeed into the future, partly because they're going to benefit from that success. More importantly, so they can protect it. And so as interest rates have gone up that have affected the cash flow, what in essence has happened is when I talked about that prior example, 3 times EBITDA banks can legally lend. Because of that, the push on cash flow or the restriction on cash flow at a higher interest rate, what we find most owners have been willing to accept, and banks have almost forced this issue anyway, is instead of loaning all the way up to the 3 times of EBITDA, owners are willing to take a much lower cash out up front, and banks are loaning maybe 1.5 to 2 times. The rest is now a lower interest rate seller note. And so when you're taking that seller note and it's subordinated, it's an interest only note behind the bank. When you're taking less principal up front from the bank, you're actually at the same level of cash flow payments at the lower dollar amount, but even at a higher interest rate than we were even 16 months ago when we were able to borrow money on these transactions at only 2.5 to 2.75% interest, whereas today we're seeing between 6.9 and 7.5% interest on the bank note. So we have not seen a downturn, as the opposite. We've had, as a firm, and I think the industry would be consistent with us, which is we've had 3 back-to-back record years, both in the number of transactions we've done, along with the overall size of the companies that we've been able to assist in implementing ESOP. So we have not seen it negatively affected because of interest rates climbing. Although I think now that interest rates most likely will stabilize, and then potentially 12 to 15 to 18 months going out, when you look at it, we could have some interest rate reductions. Although, again, I'm not an economist, although that's my background. I look and I try to read as much as I can about what's going on economically from a macro perspective. I think we're going to have longer term inflation at a little bit higher than what the Federal Reserve is looking to push to, which is 2%. I'm more in the sort of the thought process of we're going to have long term inflation around 3 to 3.25, and that should be the new metric the Federal Reserve sort of tries to achieve. But I also think that even with inflation at that rate, there's room. Once I think we potentially can have another 25 basis point adjustment on the upside from the Federal Reserve, we should see in 12 to 15 months from now interest rates coming down slightly. And I think the reason, when you simply look at long-term rates in the bond market, we're just not seeing long-term rates that have caught to short-term rates. So I think that's a pretty good indication of what's going to happen. You also asked the question, and I apologize for spending so much time on the interest rate discussion.
No, I think it's an important factor too.
Yeah, so I think it's a good backdrop. And again, remind me of the first part of the question, because I talked so long I forgot.
You threw me off here too. Well, I actually, one point that I did want to highlight as we were going through, because I think we're really zone in on it, is from a company size perspective, because we've been mentioning EBITDA just in terms, across the board. Is there a, employee count, revenue size, just really for more simplistic terms for folks when they're starting to think about this?
Yeah.
Because I know, you do have some smaller companies that, just really wouldn't qualify. So I wanted to make sure the viewers could get a backdrop there.
That's perfect. So size, where it makes sense. I mean, there's competitors that we have in the market that work what I call in the small market. That's just not where we work. And what I mean by that is, they'll work with a company that's, let's just use a landscaping company that's got, 12 employees and does $1.5 million a year top line revenue and makes $300,000 a year in profit. That's just not us. We're not a boilerplate, simplistic transaction company. We work sort of in the more sophisticated space. So for us to help a client really to do it the right way, we need EBITDA, trailing 12-month EBITDA of around $2 million. The reason why we set that as a threshold, and I've helped companies that are less than that, but the problem is we can't get any bank financing. Banks won't touch deals that are that small because there's just too much risk. They usually have too much what they call concentration focus. So they may have most of their business coming from one company or one vendor. And it just, that makes it very difficult to finance that. It also makes it very difficult to structure a deal where the owners are going to be treated fairly in price. So 2 million or more in EBITDA. Top line revenue is somewhat irrelevant because you can have an engineering firm that does, 4.5 million of top line revenue and generates 2.25 profit. Or EBITDA. So it's the EBITDA number that's important. You do need to have, on a minimum basis, you need to have 11 employees or more. There's what they call top heavy rules. You're familiar with those, Carl, in the qualified plan world. ESOPs work a little bit differently in the way the top heavy rules are governed. meaning you can't have any one employee that has 10% or more of the overall economic benefits of the plans. That's an ESOP and all other plans that are ultimately implemented. And if you do, they fall into what they call this qualified class. And then in turn, if you have more than the qualified class, those that fit into that category that end up receiving 50% or more of the overall economics of the benefits, the plan is disqualified. So that is sort of what I call the atomic bomb of ESOPs. So hence, in all reality, you could theoretically do a plan where you had 11 employees and everybody got equal benefits. Nobody would have more than a 9% benefit and their 9.1% benefit, but you're too close to the edge. So what we usually say is we want 20 or more employees that are full-time, at least 1,000 hours, that have worked with you at least 1 year. That gives you plenty of cushion if people end up leaving or you have people that die or some circumstance takes place without any issue. And the simple rule of thumb is, because it is a qualified retirement plan in the way that it does work, the benefits and the way they're provided, what I say is you want 20 or more employees to start for a 10 million or more valuation firm. And for every $10 million in additional value, you need another 10 employees. So if you're a $20 million valuation firm, you need to have 30 employees. If you're a $30 million valuation firm, you need to have 40 employees. And that really isn't that you have to worry of the top heavy rules. It's that you want to be able to provide enough benefits that it makes the overall strategy worthwhile, meaning you're going to provide significant benefits over time to employees, but you don't want to have too few of employees that you're going to make them all rich in a very short period of time. And all of a sudden now, if you're 10 years into the plan, you've got 15 employees in the company. They've all got, $2 million to their name in their ESOP, and they all simultaneously quit because they expect to get $2 million and they don't need any more than that for retirement, because you're talking about normal rank and file employees, people that are probably earning 40, 50, 60,000 a year, and $2 million handing it to them overnight when they're 45 or 50 years old is probably enough money. They probably wouldn't have to do much after that. So the idea of the size on a minimum basis is important, because we want to be able to get you bank financing, so there's cash that comes out at closing. We also want to be able to, because the cost and the sophistication of truly doing an ESOP the right way, if you're less than $10 million, the cost to implement and do it right with all the various parties that have to be hired becomes too big of a burden on the company. I mean, if you got to spend 6 or 7 or 8% of the sale price ultimately to go ahead and orchestrate and implement an ESOP in the first year, I'm just not one to think that that's worthwhile. Because remember, you're not getting all it'd be different if you had a $10 million company or a $9 million company and we got you 9 million cash up front, you walk away with. Then if you've got to pay, 500 or 600,000 to sell the company and do the transaction, you're paying it out of the 9 million in cash you're getting. The problem is if you only get 3 million in cash and it costs you 600,000, that's a big price to pay on the level of cash you're getting out. So you need to be big enough where the cost to do the transaction isn't a burden to the transaction. Okay.
And I think you've highlighted a couple big follow-up questions. So, when we talk about some of the pros and cons of the plan, being one, I'd love to highlight some of the different tax benefits. You mentioned being a qualified plan, and then you mentioned obviously the cons being the cost. Are there any other things outside of the cost that you see as a big con? And then I'd love you to highlight some of the different tax benefits and how those work as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the industry, and this is where really what comes to light, which is incorrect from those that we end up competing with that are investment bankers, and they're very good at what they do. If you just want to represent and hire an investment banker or an investment banking firm, and there's very good ones out there, to create what they call a SIM, which is a memorandum document that you take to the public, and they shop it with private equity and strategic buyers, and they'll charge you a fee for that. That's a positive way to exit. It's a positive way to get money. And, it takes away a lot of the theoretical risk, and there's really no complexity to it, because it's just like selling a piece of real estate. You shop it to the highest price bidder, they buy it, and you negotiate the terms, and then you get a check and you walk away. So that's pretty easy to do from a process standpoint. And ESOP, part of the challenge and part of what the investment bankers will say is they'll tell you that ESOPs are so complicated, there's so many moving parts, it's too difficult, you'll never want to do it, you'll get impatient through the process. And I will tell you, it is there's a lot of complexity to it because the tax benefits, and we'll address the tax benefits as a positive. Because anything that provides significant tax benefits under the US tax code is going to create complexity because the IRS demands it. And you have to follow all the guidelines and rules. But all that being said, that's what firms like BTA does. And there's a number of very good firms in our industry that do exactly what we do. We keep the clients out of the fray of doing the work and following all the complexity. And it allows them to really continue operating and running the business, which is critical because you want to continue to keep that cash flow being driven. And then we keep the owners and the management team focused on what they do. And then we take on the responsibility of working with the team and all the players to make sure the transaction gets completed and done, both timely and that all the wishes of the client are fulfilled. That's what a firm like ours does to keep them out of it. We get back to the basics of where is the risk? The risk is in cash flow. I mean, fundamentally, like any business, cash flow drives the success of that company. And so volatile cash flow companies shouldn't be looking at ESOPs. And companies that do have a downturn, and this is what gets into owners that do ESOPs care as much about the operations and the legacy and want to see it perpetuated. So one of the reasons why that seller note is so valuable in the way the company will operate is we have had, and I would love to say every deal we've done has been perfect. We had one failure in over 400 transactions, but that company would have failed. It was a home builder. I think, Carl, you live in Florida. You have residency in Florida. It was a home builder in South Florida. We did an ESOP in 2007. We all know what happened in the home construction world in 2008, 2009. The company went from multi-$100 million annual revenue to less than $12 million in revenue, and you just can't survive as a company doing that kind of construction in the home space or in any business. So byproduct is cash flow is important, but why those seller notes are so valuable is because when a company, and when we stress test a transaction, we show that theoretically a company can have a 40% decline in revenue and still meet its working capital, operating expenses, CapEx requirements without laying anybody off, and still meet its overall debt obligations. It's when you drop below 40% decline, if you still haven't laid anybody off, or the likelihood is most executives in that scenario will have reduced their working capital requirements, reduce their CapEx requirements. But let's assume that didn't happen. Because of that seller note, the owner can always defer principal and interest payments. They can defer principal payments and add them to the back end so that the company can recover from a cash flow standpoint. They can either put a complete hold on interest and principal up until the company recovers. It doesn't mean you're not going to collect it. You'll collect it plus the accrued interest that would have been paid. But the byproduct is that's what gives the protection to the company to survive significant macro downturns that might take place from an economic standpoint. So that's where the risk applies, and that's where also the offset takes place on how you look at the recovery.
Are there any other flexibility concerns with these plans? I know business owners sometimes come to me as far as with questions, what kind of flexibility do these set plans have? I don't want to give up control. Do you see that as a negative with these plans or any issues there for business owners to be mindful of?
That's a great question. That's another misnomer in the industry. So, again, I will tell you, if you sell to a strategic or a private equity firm, I will promise you, you have lost control because they now own the company. They're going to run it, operate it, and do whatever they want, including terminate you as the selling shareholder, along with oftentimes many of your management team. And I have experienced that from a personal standpoint of a company that I own that I sold to a private equity firm a number of years ago. And that was both one of the best days of my life, but also very shortly thereafter, the worst days of my life. So that's something you need to go into and understand if you're going to go down that path. The flexibility in an ESOP, and this is really in the design of the way it gets created, which is, again, why we work with typically a little bit bigger companies that are looking for more sophistication in the process. Because when you think about it, since when you do an ESOP, you can and your management team will stay on board for as long as you, as the CEO president, will choose to. Nobody's walking you out the door. You'll have an employment package with compensation and benefits that get negotiated, and you can operate and run the company for as long as you choose. When you want to give up that responsibility, all of our selling shareholders also sit on the board of their companies and usually act as the chairman of the board. And the way that we construct these transactions is whether you sell one single share to the ESOP for the benefit of the employees, or you sell 100% of the stock to the ESOP for the benefit of the employees, the level of control that you'll maintain is no different one way or the other. The benefit of selling it this way through an ESOP is the nature of the transaction as the Board will have not operating responsibilities because that's the CEO, the management team, the CFO. They actually operate the business, but they have a boss, and the boss is the board of directors under corporate law in every state in this country. And so as long as the owner wants to stick around or have family or other key management that will sit on the board of directors of the company, they'll maintain a high degree of control moving forward on helping provide guidance to the management team when they want to step down from the management responsibilities of the company, so that acquisitions, a sale of the company, opening up new offices, taking on additional significant debt other than CapEx debt, all those decisions actually get voted on and made by the board of directors, which again, they will still have a high degree of control over. That's the way we structure the transactions. The differences are, and this is the one piece that every business owner needs to understand. When you own a private company, you control what I call the piracy rights or the cookie jar rights, meaning anytime there's excess cash in the cookie jar, you own the company, you own 100% of the stock, you can reach into that cookie jar, go to your CFO, say, cut me a check for 100, $500,000, $1 million, whatever the excess surplus is, make it as a distribution or as a dividend or as a bonus for compensation. There are no restrictions to that. When you do an ESOP, the one restriction you do have is you do give up what I call cookie jar rights or piracy rights. The cash in the corporation is for the benefit of all parties, including the ESOP. And so you have now, as a board and as an executive management team, you do take on some fiduciary responsibilities, because the role that you fill is not just fulfilling the role for yourself as the primary shareholder in the past. Your role is to fill the role as supporting the shareholder, which is the ESOP, which is that qualified retirement plan that holds the stock on behalf of the employees. And your job is to make sure that you're running the company and operating the company to help all shareholders, not just you, but all the employees in the firm, and act in the best interest of the company moving forward. That's a key change that does take place when you do a sale to the ESOP.
Can you and I think we've gone through a bunch of different things here. Could you just walk through yeah, more specifically to just high level, the actual how it works from the tax perspective? Because I know that's one of the biggest benefits that obviously gets advisors, both on my side and the tax side excited. So maybe walk through what it looks like for a C corporation and what this transaction looks like from an S corporation perspective.
Perfect. So there's three key significant tax benefits of an ESOP, which is one reason why they're gaining so much traction. The first is there's a concept called, and I'll just give you the acronym on the tax code section, it's called the 1042. So those that have ever invested in real estate, that understand 1031 real estate exchanges, or in the world of insurance, 1035, which allows you to swap from one cash value life insurance policy to another and roll your investment and your capital back in to the new purchase, you can avoid paying taxes on that rollover. ESOPs have favorable treatment that owners that sell their stock and do so at the time of the stock transaction as a C corporate sale and sell at least 30% of the stock to the ESOP can, for that portion of proceeds, elect the 1042. So if your company is worth, for simplicity, $20 million, and you're in a state like California or New York or New Jersey, where you've got close to 35 to 37% overall state and federal tax rates on capital gain, then in those states on $20 million, if you just simply say it's 40%, you'd have $8 million in taxes that you'd have to pay between state and federal, which is relatively significant. And so if you did it as a C Corp and you sold the 100% of the company, as an example, you could elect the 1042. You would reinvest a portion of the proceeds that would qualify into what they call qualifying investments, which are public company stocks, bonds, or debt instruments that fulfill the IRS requirements, and you're able to postpone paying state and federal capital gains tax. If you hold those replacement assets till death, your family inherits them, gets what they call a step up in basis, the same as the 1031 real estate exchange. They can sell then those assets out at that point in time, and they pay not a penny of capital gains, state and federal tax. So that's very attractive, and one of the reasons why in those states, when owners are looking at apples to apples comparisons financially of selling to a strategic or private equity or selling to an ESOP, if they get the same amount of money in both scenarios, but in one they pay no capital gains tax, it's pretty favorable. So that's the personal tax benefit. If you do it as an S Corp, you're subject to paying capital gains tax. And that's where a good advisor like you yourself, Carl, come into play, because working with advisors, most of our clients that do that in places like Florida, Texas, Tennessee, usually states that have no state or very low state income taxes, they say, you know what, I don't mind paying the federal rate, but I want to be able to manage when I'm going to pay it. Our clients elect an installment basis. They pay it as they receive principal over time. And that gives them time to do a tremendous amount of planning, from investment planning to create some potential offsetting losses to help minimize it, to charitable planning to help minimize the capital gain. So that's the nature of the front end for the selling shareholders. And that's, obviously pretty significant. When you get into the corporate benefits, this is where the dynamics between the C Corp, which is good for the selling shareholder because you can elect the 1042, but you ultimately want an ESOP company to be an S Corp. And this is the most attractive operating structure. And it's the only legal way in America you can be a for-profit company and be tax-free. 100% ESOP owned S Corp is a tax exempt organization. It's still a for-profit. So don't kid yourself. We're not converting from a for-profit to a not-for-profit company. It's a for-profit company that is exempt from paying any form of state and federal taxes. The benefit of doing that is pretty simple. Imagine now your company, Carl, and you're no longer subjected on all your profits of paying a dime of income taxes. One, it creates more cash flow. And when you go back and think about how we buy the company, it's a leverage buyout. We're now simply diverting the income taxes that the owners previously had to pay, most likely on their K-1 distributions at a much higher tax rate. And we're diverting that over to now turn around, since the company is tax-free, to turn around and pay off the debt. So the simple way I always explain it to every business owner is, let's just assume your company's worth $20 million and you're generating approximately $4 million a year taxable income. To make it simple. At ordinary income tax rates in your state, you're paying about 50% marginal taxes. So on 4 million, you're paying 2 million in tax, and that leaves the company with about 2 million of free cash flow, some of which you're distributing out for planes, trains, automobiles, vacations, fund, personal investments, real estate, things like that. The byproduct, though, is in an ESOP, we're going to take that 2 million of tax savings and we're going to redirect that to pay off the $20 million in debt. So we're taking the 2 million to pay off the bank debt and the seller notes. And then hopefully over the next few years, while we're doing that, the company grows from 2 million of net profit or 4 million net profit to 4.5 to 5 to 5.5, because your employees start thinking more like owners, since they now directly get benefits tied to the stock they get allocated. So you change the cultural mindset of your employees to start thinking like, focusing more on customer service, profitability, margin expansion, all the things that will drive increased profitability for the company. So over the next typically 8 to 10 years, all the debt gets paid off, and it all gets paid off out of the tax savings, being a tax-free organization moving forward. Now, let's get to the last attribute, and that is, if you're an S Corp today, and you want to do the 1042, and you have to, what they call, revoke your S and convert it to a C, so you can do the 1042, under the IRS's guidelines, when you do that revocation of an S to convert back to a C, you have to stay as a C Corp for 5 years. So for that 5-year period, you're paying corporate income taxes. So the key is, during that 5-year period of time while you're paying corporate income taxes, the ESOP has additional tax benefits, meaning that the payments that you're actually making to the bank in the way that we structure them become deductible. And so we're actually getting additional deductions as a C Corp that you didn't have previously. And so we're not going to eliminate the corporate taxes that have to be paid during that 5-year period of time. But if normally you're paying 2 million in ordinary income taxes as a K-1 shareholder, and now you get the 4 million of profit on the corporate balance sheet, we're actually going to reduce the profits of the company because of that debt payment we're making of the 2 million a year to the bank and the interest on your note. The byproduct is now you're not paying taxes on 4 million. The corporation is going to pay taxes in the example on 2. So at 21% federal rates plus state, you're at 25%. You drop 2 million in tax responsibility to 500,000 at the corporate level, which still leaves you $1.5 million more free cash flow you didn't have before. So that's the benefit during that 5-year period of time, which is attractive when we're doing either partial sales, because partial sales aren't 100% tax-free. So that methodology I just passed on works in that scenario, or when you're doing a conversion from an S or a revocation to an S to a C to do the 1042, and we have to deal with corporate taxes, we minimize those taxes through the way the ESOP works.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big tickets when we were thinking about this. We're talking a lot about taxes, so why don't we talk a little bit about any big changes on the government front, and tax law, et cetera. Anything you guys are seeing on your end and how it may have, regulation wise and, things that are going on there that may affect your business in the future?
Yeah, it's actually been positive. I mean, if you think about it, and I can take a quick moment to talk about the philosophy by why Congress supports ESOPs. The studies show the average American, I'm talking about executives, salespeople, I'm talking about the average worker in the average company, whether it's people, white collar employees that are doing, collections and receivables for construction companies or people in the factory floor of a manufacturing facility. But these are individuals that earn, 40 to 50 to 60,000 a year, probably aren't saving as much as we would all like them to in the financial services industry on what they should be putting away for their 401ks. The studies show that those employees retire at age 65 with about $99,000 in retirement savings and about $2,100 a month in Social Security benefits. So
Mhm.
in all reality, when they retire at 65, even if they choose to, most can't because they don't have the money to do so, but if they choose to, they're living actually below the poverty line.
Yep.
And so, Congress looked at that and said, how do we encourage, we can't have the federal government providing the full burden of responsibility to support people in retirement. So the byproduct is the idea of the ESOP, and the studies show that ESOPs provide a benefit of 300 to 500% greater than the company was providing pre-ESOP. So that same employee that retires at age 65 with 99,000 in a 401k ultimately now has an added benefit of the ESOP of $300,000 to $500,000. So they're still going to get their $2,100 a month from Social Security, but now if you look at just amortizing on an annuity basis, an extra $300,000 to $500,000, it provides an extra $3,200 to $5,400 a month in additional retirement savings over the life expectancy of those individuals. For that reason, the government is encouraging businesses to do so, which is why they provided the tax benefits both to the selling shareholder along with the company to support the idea that companies will be highly motivated to look at ESOPs as a strategy. I think you also mentioned the question about additional tax changes. We really haven't seen any. The positive is, as we talked about, that idea of the 1042 requires a C corporate structure. And what has been bannered about by our industry, by lobbyists that we work with in our industry, trying to influence Congress to provide support both to S corps as equally as provided to C corps. We have had for the last 8 years proposed legislation that has got on various bills as an attachment to change the laws to support the ability of doing 1042 as S corps. It's never made it past the bill stage. This past election, after the President Biden was elected, there was, as part of a number of the funding bills that were provided for some of the stimulus under the COVID scenarios, there was the provision that was put onto a bill that went through committee, and it's as far as the bill ever got. But it got through committee, was approved through the committee, but got taken off as part of the final negotiations between in Congress between the House and between the Republicans and the Democrats, and it got taken off the bill at that point in time. The good news behind that is it shows that there's now committee support, and hopefully the next time there's going to be tax bills that will be proposed, it makes sense. There's no reason why they shouldn't treat S corps identically the way they treat C corps for purposes of the 1042, because that will encourage even more business owners to look at doing ESOPs. And if that's the incentive our Congress has, they should support it on both sides. But there is no negative tax proposals that have been in play for the last, as long as I've been in the M&A world. I've not seen anything. We don't see anything on the horizon that would change that.
And then as we finish up, why don't you talk a little bit about what it would look like from a process standpoint to work with you guys, evaluate whether an ESOP makes sense, and then how that plays in for the whole M&A process, just as as clients will experience it.
Yep. So we're a big believer in education, because one thing I learned a long time ago, and I'm 64 years old now, so been around a long time. I'm closer to the end of the road than I am at the beginning of the road now that I've reached this point in my life. And so I take a more realistic approach to it, and I realize not only for myself, but for successful people like yourself, Carl, and your clients, our most valuable asset is our time. And so what I don't want to do is waste my time, my company's time, or your time or your client's time, taking them down a path that makes no sense and having them spend money when it ultimately is not going to make sense. So we began, and I can't speak to everybody in our industry, but we began doing basically interviews, discussion points. It's acting really as a consultant or advisor in the front end. We don't charge for it. We ask you to put, or our clients, to spend time with us, usually via Zoom, or if we're in the marketplace, we will do it face to face. We usually ask for an hour of their time on the front end. I want to understand their business. I want to understand what their objectives and goals are, because we talked about a lot today, much of an ESOP is the philosophy and the objectives of the client. It's not about the money. And the money's the money. It'll be there, but it's really about what are your objectives. And so I want to really understand the business and what the owners are trying to accomplish. And after that discussion, if what they say fits the role of where an ESOP I think makes sense, then what I'll do is I'll take the time to walk them down, kind of, now that I know about the business, I can walk them through the path of, in essence, what an ESOP theoretically could look like, what benefits they would receive, what benefits the company would receive, what benefits their employees would receive, and ultimately, how the company and the legacy of the business would be perpetuated. We do that. I can do that usually in an hour time frame. Pretty straightforward. At the end of that conversation, if the client now is intrigued and says, yes, I think it makes sense, at least as an option, and myself believe that through the conversation, the client does fit the profile. And through a simple series of questions, I can get enough understanding of the business that I can determine, is the company sufficient enough financially to meet our minimum criteria? Then what I say is, get me 3 years of your financials. We have a 4-page fact finder that's an information gathering tool. Usually doesn't take a client more than 20 to 30 minutes to complete. Get me that information back, and at no cost, I'll review it and have one of my CFA, CPA analysts review it to get a general idea from the standpoint of the financial aspects. And then I can come back to you and the client and say, in the back of the napkin, here's basically what the range of value of your business would be. And the reason we do that at no cost and do it at the front end is, again, before they're going to spend any money, and we're going to dedicate a lot of time into the analysis and the valuation modeling. What I don't want to do is, we come back and say the range of your business is worth $10 to $15 million, and the client thought that their business was worth 30 to 40 million.
Yeah.
I don't want to set it. I do not want to go into a deal setting improper expectations on value. So we're going to tell them what we think the range is. We're going to be conservative on that. And as long as we're within the framework, then it makes sense to go to the next stage, which is to spend a little bit of money to do a formal ESOP valuation of the business, and then take that valuation and then turn around and create what we call a feasibility study or an ESOP modeling analysis to show a series of options, maybe a partial sale, a C Corp transactional sale, an S Corp transactional sale. And then what we will also do is provide them to provide a comparison. We will show you if in turn you did it through a private equity or you did it through a strategic sale, when you compare what that sale would ultimately do for you both up front and over time versus what the ESOP will do economically, it gives all the ammunition to the owner to say, I like the concept, it makes sense, and it gives them a series of options. Kind of like if you think about it, if you've ever been to Morton's Steakhouse, when you walk in, you sit down, they walk up with that big old tray of, 14 different types of steaks, the big lobster, the 3 different fishes. You don't know what you want to eat that night until you actually see it all, and then you can make the choice, and then everything else is a la carte. In reality, getting back to the flexibility, everything about the ESOP transaction is flexible. And so we don't want to just show somebody one option because we don't know whether that's the right option for them. So we're going to give them a series of options and then show them the comparison. I mean, I've helped more business owners to understand that it makes sense to really look at doing a strategic private equity or even a management buyout when all is said and done, when we find out really what they're trying to accomplish and they know what the financials look like, versus doing an ESOP. But at least now they've got all the financial and the philosophical information to understand the mechanics, including the tax benefits to them, including the tax benefits to the company, including the overall debt capacity, what the company can take on as debt as it relates to the transactional sale. How can it cash flow? What's the operating cash flow going to look like of the company? And then what the overall economics look like over the life of the transaction. Because even though we haven't talked about this because this gets into some of the sophistication, you can sell 100% of your company, get paid for the full value of the 100%, both in cash up front and that seller note that we talked about, and still have 20 to 25% of the future equity value as a kicker for the fact that you did an ESOP and that you took back that seller note and subordinated to the bank. So, bottom line is you think about it, and this is how we compete with oftentimes financially with strategic and private equity firms when it comes to overall dollars. Take the tax benefits out, just overall gross dollars. And then when you net them out from a tax standpoint, the ESOP can be far more favorable. But, think about it. You sell a $20 million company and over the life of the transaction, pocketing almost $35 million. If you sold the company up front at a $4 million EBITDA for a $20 million value and you're overall collecting $35 million. And when you net out for taxes, you end up netting out, let's say $31 million. You're actually getting almost an 8 multiple for the sale of your business. That's unheard of if you're a construction company or a manufacturing firm. And that's where ESOPs, from a financial perspective, when owners really get to understand the economics long term, along with all the objectives and goals that are able to be fulfilled for them, is why it makes so much sense once they've got that information. So we typically charge between 10 to 25,000 for that second stage of the transaction, but that answers every question every client would have: the value, the nature, the options, the overall ramifications, the structure of the transaction, the benefits to the employees, the benefits to their management team, and obviously the benefits to themselves. And does it work from a cash flow standpoint to be able to take on all that debt to be able to do the acquisition of the company? And how long is it going to take to get fully paid out over the time frame of the entire transaction? All of that gets answered. At the end of that, then we can price out what the implementation is. And
Yep.
so this is where, again, the nature of an ESOP is different than just a pure investment banking transaction. And that is, in an ESOP, you've got what they call the sell side representation. That's what we are. We're representing the selling client, the shareholders, to get maximum value, maximum terms and conditions, and maximum benefits, all within reason, so it properly works from a cash flow standpoint. Then you have to hire on top of that an independent group called the trustee that represents the employees in the ESOP trust. That independent trustee, there are trust companies that do this, there are independent firms that do it, there are mid-sized firms that specialize in ESOP transactions. We have great relationships with almost all of the firms out there, but bottom line is, we usually go through an interviewing process with a client. They'll interview 2 or 3 of the trustees. They'll pick one that they like. We'll give them some general guidance based on our history of working with those firms and what the objectives are. Then they turn around, the trustee hires their own valuation group, hires their own separate legal counsel, who will also then provide, they have to go out oftentimes and acquire what they call a fairness opinion, making sure the transaction properly negotiated by both parties was considered by an independent to be fair and reasonable. So between our fee, the ERISA and transaction counsel on the sell side, the trustees valuation group, and trustees legal counsel, when you take all those people and put them together, that's where the complexity comes into play, along with the cost. And that's why, to do it in reality, do a $5 million transaction is the same expense for the parties to do a $30 million transaction. The difference is, though, is the bigger the deal, the higher the fees, not because it requires more work. It's just, in the industry, it's just the nature of the beast. There's more risk to all the parties, that the bigger the deal, the greater the likelihood that the transaction will be audited by the DOL and be reviewed. And so everybody charges what they call risk premium. So correspondingly, at $10 million, we can do a deal that's fair, that's reasonable, that works. You're looking at about a 4% all-in cost to do that type of transaction with all parties at 10 million. And then when you take that scale up, once you get over about $100 to $150 million, the fees correspondingly start dropping from 4%, starts dropping to 3%, to 2%, to 1% on the bigger deals. And that's, again, all-in fees that you can expect as you're doing transactions. Bottom line is, what I tell every business owner, the fee is important to understand, but in all reality, working with a good firm, they're going to be able to package it with all the parties, so that the costs are going to be paid in the first year by all the tax savings that are generated by the company to do the transaction. So you're letting the IRS pay the fees to implement, and different than a private equity transaction or strategic sale with an investment banker. If you sell your company for 20 million and you pay a 5% fee, which is $1 million, you're netting 19 million out of the sale. The same $20 million sale in an ESOP, the company pays the fee, it pays it out of the tax savings, and you're collecting still the full $20 million. So the fee is not a burden paid by the selling shareholder. It's a fee that is paid by the corporation. So not that encourages owners to look at an ESOP over a private equity transaction. It's just an added benefit of the way the ESOP does work.
And I think that's for our viewers. I think the big takeaway here is that's why you work with folks like Rick. You want to have an expert who can walk you through all the options, put them on the table, and then you can figure out what makes the most sense for your business as well as your family when it comes to exiting. So, Rick, with that, thank you so much for providing this wealth of information. For folks listening, if you do have more questions, please reach out to me. Rick is a resource of mine. We've done work together, and I'd love to, put him in front of you, if it does make sense, and he can be a great resource to your business. So once again, Rick, thank you so much for your time. We all greatly appreciate it.
Carl, thank you so much. Everybody have a great day and have a great weekend coming up.
All right, cheers. Thank you.
Bye-bye.